then we'll move to our Standards and Assessment Committee. Board Member Gravitt.
Okay, it's always on to the every time. Fun topic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so item number 1, 12.1 is instructional materials for implementation of human trafficking prevention and awareness requirements in 53G 9207. So just as some background, this law requires that school districts and charters provide biennial training regarding child sexual abuse and human trafficking. We needed to also approve instructional materials, which we did. And so the motion for the board is the committee moves that the board approve the 3 Strands Global Foundation and the Refugee and Immigrant Center Asian Association of Utah as the providers for human trafficking awareness and prevention instructional materials.
Okay, the motion before us approves and prevention instructional materials. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my document to come up. I looked down through this, which I thought most of it was really good. Oh, here we go. There was a slide. Slide number 2 that used, okay, so I think this is just wrong, and maybe I'm wrong, but it says training resources are available and digestible for adults, youth serving adults. For Utah's youth serving adults. I think that's supposed to be adults serving youth.
That's the intent.
Okay, well, the wording's not right.
We actually talked about that,
Oh, you did? Did
think.
you correct it? Because it's on here, not corrected.
Well, I can't remember, does anyone remember on committee? I think it was like, that's what it was called. But I thought we
Well, whatever's
cleaned
here
that.
isn't cleaned up.
Because the intent is what you said.
Right, but I think we want to maybe make sure that's clear, so. It's listed a couple of
Is
times
Jeff
on here.
Or Corby? Yeah, we have
It's
this
supposed
very-
to be youth serving adults?
Corby, please help us. Chair Mahi.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, my name is Corby Easton, Prevention Specialist here at the Utah State Board of Education.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and so originally, previously, it was youth serving adult, it's supposed to be adult serving youth, and that can be a
So the hyphen would clarify that, right?
yes.
Yes.
Okay, got it, we're done.
Hyphen's very important. No, hyphen is good.
Yeah.
But the hyphen is what makes it okay.
Yes, you're right.
Yes.
It's the youth
Without the
ser-
hyphen, it's
it becomes
confusing.
an adjective, youth
Yep.
serving adults. Yeah. Okay. I read it the other way.
I feel like we just had a mini conversation like we did in committee.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you, Corby, for
Anyway.
answering the question. Okay. Thank you.
That was a really weird process.
Board Member Cannon, you're next.
Along the same lines, and I note that it's noted here in our thing, but it hasn't been changed on our board docs. So we have a thing called human trafficking trends and best practices, which I think gives the wrong impression, you know. So we wanted to remove the word best.
We
but
did.
It's still on our docs here. So the same kind of thing you had concern about.
Yeah, it was removed, right, Corby?
It still shows up on our board docs.
Yes, may I?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Good luck.
Yeah.
Just kidding, sorry.
yeah, so it should have been 2 different PowerPoints, one with the old version, then one with the corrected version later in Civic Clerk. With that change
I
of,
think, just a minute.
I think the intent is that we're not promoting youth serving adults or human trafficking best practices.
Or ways to
So,
best.
is there any other comments on this? Board Member Earl?
I feel like somebody should just call Corby up for fun. Just kidding.
Okay, so my question is this actual program, what's the length of time? Is it a 10-hour workshop? What's the length of time that people need to commit to this?
Yes, please come forward.
Corby, for real.
Thank you.
Well, it's biennial.
Yes, thank you.
yes. May I?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes, so it varies from vendor. So,
But we have a specific vendor, right? Because that's what I viewed.
so it's two, Street Strand Global and Immigrant and Refugee Asian Association.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so,
We're okaying a specific one, right? We're not, we're just, am I accurate in that? We're okaying two.
Two. There are two listed in the motion.
Okay. And so do we have an idea on the two time frames on those?
so it's anywhere from hour to hour. I mean, it depends on the conversation.
Okay, okay.
And so it can be done really fast, but if it's a lot of conversation, it may take longer.
Okay,
than-
so it's just a couple of hours?
Yeah,
Probably,
it's-
okay, that's all I wanted to know.
Less than two.
So-
Okay, seeing no further discussion, the motion before us is to approve the Three Strands Global Foundation and the Refugee and Immigrant Center Asian Association of Utah as providers for human trafficking awareness and prevention instructional materials. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously.
I knew if you stayed
Thank
it
you,
would
sir.
pass. Okay. Next item is 12.2, which is Board Policy 5002, the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. What we did on this one is, originally, we had specific associations named to be on the committee. We took those out and then directed staff to investigate access routes to individuals who could fill spots. The motion before the board is the committee moves that the board approve Board Policy 5002, Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee, Draft 3.
The motion before us is to approve Board Policy 5002, Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee Draft 3. Is there any discussion to that motion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Okay, 12.3 was informational, so we'll move to 12.4, which is the supplemental standards. The goal of this was to create consistency and guidance for classes, for example, like yoga, that we don't have a prescribed process. So in this case, we propose the conditions for addressing an area identified as a need, whether an LEA requests it or industry requests it. And we have a motion for the board, which was the committee moves that the board approve the process for supplemental course standards development and revision.
Okay, the motion before us is to approve the process for supplemental course standards development and revision. Any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl?
So these are only done according to requests. I'm just trying to clarify, right? Only if someone requests, we do this.
So, I mean, somebody can clarify, but if an LEA requests or an industry requests, or there's course readjustments, or you have to prioritize a course number, Jennifer will continue and speak more on
Okay.
that.
Chair, may I?
Yes.
Jennifer Thronson, it's really low. Director of Teaching and Learning. This is meant to kind of prioritize which courses. We are required by statute to have standards for not elective courses, but the applied advanced courses that we don't currently have. So we have like the core standards, which cover the core courses. Then you have electives that the teachers are writing standards for, and then you have these other applied and advanced courses that we have that by statute, we realize we are required to have standards, and we don't for some of them. And so for example, in science, I think it's about 35 classes that we don't have these standards for. We needed a way to prioritize which ones we do first. So some of that is the number of students taking the class. So if we have 2,000 kids across the state taking that class, we will develop those courses first, and then move kind of down the line. We'll also use LEAs telling us which courses they would really like to see first to help us prioritize industry if there's certain courses that industry is asking for. So those are just our areas of how we'll prioritize which courses get built first, but we have to build all of those standards for those courses. Statutory requirements require that. We just hadn't interpreted it that way in the past.
Okay, well, I looked at all the
Yes.
electives, so I'm not really sure in this millennia we'll be able to do that. So, and then the other thing
We're a
is,
little worried as well.
yeah, so that's why I'm wondering if we only do it based on a request, because something like yoga, there's going to be different philosophies, and yet you could say that each one would be as effective. So then it's like, okay, anyway, so I was just curious on trying to fully understand that.
I think the hard part is they are courses that are required for graduation, and so we needed to have some standard level of expectation of what
Okay.
those are, with some ability for,
Some
we're going to do
fluidity.
some minimum standards
Yeah.
instead of
Fair.
exhaustive to allow the teachers to have some flexibility in those. But because they are graduation requirements, it does make sense for the state to have some standards in place, but not exhaustive standards.
Okay, Board Member Lear?
Just making sure I understand, Jennifer, before you leave.
Yeah.
If that's okay. You said, as an example, yoga, but that couldn't be required for graduation.
It falls into the foundational credits for physical education. It is one of the courses you can pick from
So it's an optional,
for your PE credit for graduation.
and that's why you feel like.
Yes, that's
that-
exactly.
That helps me understand, thank you.
Okay, seeing no further discussion, the motion before us is to approve the process for supplemental course standards development and revision. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously.
Okay, item 12.5 is the resource vetting process. This one, I hope you guys had a chance to look at how this was revised. I think in a committee, we did really good work, and we added a resource review checklist. We added a place for signatures, and I'm wondering, Chair, if I could call Jennifer Thronson up to kind of highlight some of the things we did, and we changed this, before we have a discussion on it.
All right. Jennifer Thronson, Director of Teaching and Learning. And so looking across the document, we started this back in October. It came, you may have remembered, a lively conversation in November. We went back to committee, made some additional revisions, and now you have what the committee voted on to be the next iteration. So some changes. The original resource was really written to be for any resource in the agency. As the discussions kind of evolved, we realized that might be not an issue at this time. Realizing the agency produces hundreds of documents a year, to require all of these resources to go through this process when we haven't had concerns raised in the past several years over these hundreds of documents seemed to be maybe a little too far of burden on staff. And so really bringing it back to just the core guides, which are supplemental standards supports to help teachers interpret what the standards mean so there is common understanding. And so that was the main change. So you'll see some language change in the top, in the title, in the first paragraph. So when we're talking about this review process, it's specifically just on the core guides. The conversation in committee was if we start to see other resources needing to go through this process, then we would just amend the title, core guides, and include other resources that's needed. But given we haven't had issues with other resources to this point, to the level of the core guides, we thought it might be nice just to start small and grow as needed across documents. As you kind of move down, October, we had a 5-step process. We've reduced it to 4 at this time. The 5th step was around what happens if people have concerns. Even though we put it out for feedback, we've made our revisions, and we think we're done, right? And so step 5, we took off. It had a kind of an appeals process because the board already has appeals processes in place. We didn't think we needed to add layers to the processes that you already have, where people can reach out to you for support. They can make public comment. There are different vehicles for the public to express their concerns. They can come to us as staff, and we can review those as well. So those vehicles were already in place, and I think as we reviewed the document, determined to remove that step from the piece. The checklist at the end, some minor revisions of not applicable. As we started to look at some of the resources in the beginning, it was like, oh, that doesn't apply in this setting. So for example, core guides, they're meant for adults. So when you say developmentally appropriate, if the resources are for children, we would want to consider that. Given they're for adults, that doesn't necessarily apply in a core guide setting. So changes like that overall, just some minor changes. The biggest change came to documenting the review process. So on the final page, you'll notice a signature page that provides for the development team to say that they've gone through the checklist, they've reviewed the resources according to those 7 criteria, and where they feel they're supposed to get to the highest level of passing, and if they don't, then they need to review the resource. So for example, we've started this process with the health core guides just to kind of, one, see if the process works, go through the iteration and kind of learn from it. And what we've noticed is the development team using that checklist already found resources that they did remove because they violated one of those criteria. And so the checklist seems to be working, and it's definitely something when you do a development team, you find all these great resources, but you don't necessarily consider those criteria as you're going. So upon completion, using that checklist seems to be working. So that's kind of the process that we've used. At the end of that, the development team will then sign off saying they agree that those criteria have been met, but they can also say, I don't agree. So we would have that documentation of the development team on their level of agreement with that. There is a signature box at the bottom for either superintendents and or board member, the chair, to be able to also sign off if required by policy or code that says the board must approve whatever it is. So there is an additional section there. So there's a lot of kind of checks and balances on the resource to ensure that it's happening, and documentation that we would have evidence that these reviews have occurred. In the previous iteration, it was just a checklist with no evidence that that had been processed. So we now have, for the health core guides, for example, we have ones that have been signed by the developers that have developed those sections to represent that they believe that it does meet the checklist requirements. So that's kind of the significant changes you've seen. Patty, we want to add anything? Oh, template. Oh, for the standards? We added a document this morning. Board member Earl asked a question around, like, how are we defining what a core guide is? And when I was first asked, I'm like, we don't have a definition. And I'm like, oh, wait, we do. So in your resources for today, we have a template of the required components. As a team, our core guides, we've had mathematics has had them for years. Health started, science is working on theirs. And knowing that I'm an elementary teacher by trade, I didn't want to have to look at math's layout and version and then try and figure out how health decided to design theirs and how science decided to design theirs. So we came to a common template and format for staff to use for core guides moving forward. And those core guides outline what goes into a core guide and what the elements are. So we have these required components that are consistent across the grade levels just to ease the burden on our teachers. And were things that our staff felt like, yeah, everybody can have academic language that's tied to their content area. Everybody can represent what skills did you need to be able to do this skill? What are the prerequisite knowledge? So we landed on about 8 or 9 criteria, and then there's an optional one as well. So you've got that board backup. That's how we define the elements of a core guide, if that's helpful to you as well.
Board Member Earl?
Did we have a motion yet or not yet?
Was there, did
Are we
you?
carrying
I'm
on,
just
can we
waiting.
carry
Okay,
on
go ahead.
discussion first, or?
Board Member Gravitt, go ahead and make the.
So, and I
motion.
I can't remember if you added this. We also added the definition of, did you already say that?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay, because that's kind of, I know Carol was asking about that. We referenced the code that says this is anything that is not instructional
instructional
materials.
materials.
And it's referenced in code so that people can go right there and see, oh, it's not a textbook, it's not a this, okay. That's kind of important.
Yeah.
So after that discussion, the motion for the board is the committee moves that the board approve the core resource review process as amended.
Motion before us is to approve the core resource review process as amended. Any discussion to that motion, Board Member Earl?
Yeah, where to start, maybe, that's probably, I have a few amendments, for a variety of reasons, but my first amendment would be, let me go back now, sorry. Sorry, I clicked off of it. So it would be, under step 1, identified need would be request received from multiple districts. I'll put on there 2 board members, or 2 board members would be the addition or charters. Okay, so I'm sorry, it needs to go after that. So it'd be multiple districts or charters. Is that it? Yes, that's it. That's it. 2 board members or staff identifies an area of need. That would be motion number 1. And then I do have
Is there a second?
oh, sorry. Second?
Okay. The motion to amend is to add 2 board members to step 1. So it would read step 1 is request received from multiple districts or charters, 2 board members or staff identifies an area of need. So we're adding 2 board members in the amendment. So is there any discussion to that amendment? Okay, Board Member Lear, are you speaking to this motion?
Yes, first of all, identifies needs to be identify, and, because they're all plural subjects, but that's not my.
We can amend.
I am concerned that this, I wouldn't mind it if the whole board voted together to identify a need. I don't think that 1 or 2 board members, well, it'd have to be 2, or short of a majority of board members should stop this process at the disadvantage of multiple LEAs. So I don't know if you can propose something that makes me feel better about that. But right now, 2 board members should not be speaking for the whole board. I don't feel I can stop a process that is beneficial to LEAs.
Can I clarify real quick?
Yes.
It's not saying it's stopping any process. It's saying that if they identify a need, just like a charter or multiple districts or staff, that they can request just like they can as a
Request-
resource. Yeah.
I'm sorry, so flesh that out a little bit more. If-
Well, what are they identifying in the first place here? What
If
are
they
the
need a
charters
board guide.
identifying? Then staff are identifying that, so also board members would be able to identify that. It's not stopping any kind of a process.
it would identify a need
For a core guide.
for a core guide, is that
Yes.
what you're saying?
it would come to the discussion of the board.
Yeah, we'd go through the regular process of anything else.
Okay, when I say stop, that's maybe not the best word, but I think it does halt the process while, I guess while that need is assessed. Would that not be true?
Are you doing that same assessment with everyone else that's requesting the need? Because then it wouldn't be any more time consuming, I don't think, than anyone else, so.
I guess I see a difference between an LEA, which is multiple people and multiple students, versus 2 individuals.
So,
That's it. I'm still wrestling with the efficacy of that
okay, Board Member
in
Belknap.
my head.
Chair, I think you can probably answer this. Isn't it already the case that if you have 2 board members that it already can happen? Or am I missing, is it something else?
So to differentiate these
Yeah.
2 processes, any 2 board members can request, as our bylaws, can request an agenda item to
Okay.
be placed on an agenda. So this is a process of requesting a new resource, is that correct? A new resource to
New
be
core
added
guide.
to a core guide or a new core guide. So they're 2 very different things, and so, yes. Board
I'm not,
member.
I'm not done yet.
Okay, sorry, follow up?
Sorry.
I just was raising my hand because my. Sorry.
Sorry, Chair. So for clarity then, could, there's no core guide here. And so I, as a member of the community, why can't I say to one of my staff, or a board member say, I think we need a core guide? So they could, so any of us could say, let's look at a core guide, and then it goes to standards and assessment, correct?
I don't know that core guides go to standards and assessment for approval, is that correct?
They would not. They don't currently, and under this process, they would not go to the Standards and Assessment Committee.
Okay.
This is creating a process for how they become reviewed. But coming from staff, we would not create a resource because 1 or 2 LEAs asked us.
Right.
Our burden of time is significant, especially in a core guide experience. We would go elicit more LEAs feedback to see if we would want to take the time and effort to do that. So I appreciate Board Member Lear's suggestion of more of you, maybe 5 or 6, saying, yes, we need this. Core guides, from a staff perspective, we are moving that direction on our own because the field has already asked us. They said, we love math, why don't you have these in the other areas? And so we are moving forward with these. There's probably no cause to have them. We are basically intending to do them for every content that comes out because the field is finding them so valuable.
Okay. Board Member Hanson?
Just a question maybe for clarification. So when we talk about this process, this vetting process, this is a resource review process. I understood that this would be conducted for each resource that's included in the core guide. So this isn't just for the whole core guide. So when I hear a suggestion from Board Member Earl that there's a resource that two board members want to have vetted, that's what I'm looking at, is just one link or one source of information, not an entire core guide. Am I looking at that correctly? Is that the right understanding?
So this is the identified area of need, I guess is the difference. I'm going to be quiet.
I'm sorry, I can't
Board
push my
Member
button.
Gravitt,
So
go ahead.
I think we're kind of mixing up the issue here. This step one is, we have new standards, we have new health standards, we have new math standards. The field is asking for some guidance, for a core guide to educate teachers. Step number one is, districts around the state say, our teachers really need a core guide. I just don't think it's our place as a board to say, if I got with Carol and I'm like, I really think we should have something to do with semicolons because we really like them. You know, like, I don't know that that's our position. This is to identify that our field needs core guides because we have new standards or we have new something or teachers are asking for help. I just don't know that it's the board's place to say, they need to learn this. No, that's what our standards are for. And we have multiple districts, but we're confusing, that's a different topic than what Board Member Hanson's saying with reviewing. This is a need to identify we need core guides to help teachers. I just wanted to clarify that because I think people are confused.
Okay,
Oh, well, I guess that didn't work then.
Chair Huntsman.
And I'm going to speak against the proposed amendment because if I'm already in a position and communicating with different LEAs and what they need or what they want, and if they're not getting something that they need or want from USBE, I hear about it, and I also recognize that they have a voice and they know how to communicate also, and I'm like, do I as a board member want to get into the core guide business and have that on my agenda? There's already a vehicle that's in place and what's being proposed here to answer the request of those that have a need. Not everyone has that need, and so I just kind of see that me getting involved in this is kind of getting into the crossing over into operations. And so that's my biggest concern rolling into this is, so I'm against the motion.
Board Member Bolter.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand then, because we're elected on this state board, and the concerns that I've brought up or needs that have come forward have been because they've been brought up to me via emails or phone calls from the people in District 15 who elected me. And so do I just email back and say, thanks for your concern, but guess what, I'm not a staff, nor am I a multiple district or charter, so I can't do anything. And then do multiple staff members have to, or is it just one? Because if we have an issue with two board members, because it's not a lot of people, what are we trying to silence? I guess is what I'm trying to get to.
May I
So
try?
it really feels like we're trying to silence something.
So I think what's being confused is that this is about how we go about creating the resource. What you're trying to address is when we receive a concern about the resource created. And so that's not in this process.
Right, if we want a resource.
No.
And that part actually comes later in the steps. So
Yeah, you have to
if
go
we
down.
want to be able to have feedback from the field or the public, which is in step 3 or 4, step 4, that's the opportunity for feedback. That's when people can say, we released the guide, and they tell us, you missed a great resource, or this one's a little questionable, I'm concerned about this. That's step 4. And anyone from the public is allowed to provide that feedback. So that part is built into the process, but it doesn't come into the queuing of creating the resource, which is what step 1 is engaging with. I hope that makes sense.
Can you define for me really quickly, so I think for several of us, we see a resource as a part of a core guide. So a core guide contains resources, and yet it feels like from your title that you are using that word resource to refer only to the core guide as a whole, or not?
So no, we would analyze each resource in the core guide with these 7 criteria. So each website, each resource that's referenced would go with those 7 criteria. So it's, for health, it's hundreds, right? Hence why it's taken us weeks we're almost through secondary, and then we'll move on to elementary. It's a lot of resources to take those 7 criteria through. So what the team is doing is going through each resource and using that checklist to ensure that it meets those 7 criteria for each resource embedded in the one resource.
Okay, Patty?
Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman. One of the reasons why there is that differentiation is this was supposed to be about the core guides, then the resources was in the core guides, instead of talking about all resources to begin with. And so that's why it's a subset of. And so originally it stated that this was a resource vetting document, but that would be any resource, from a calendar to a clarification to a definition to videos to any training material whatsoever. So that was the reason why this was changed during committee, for this to be specific to core resource guide, the core guide, and then the resources within that. So that's why this conversation is more narrow in focus.
So I'm going to ask for one more clarifying definition. So you're also using the word developed, USBE developed as in past tense, although I'm feeling like you're using step 1 as a new, only step 1 would only happen to something that is new, that hasn't been created before. And so I think there's a little bit of confusion as to what this process is and how it can be used and who can use it at what point. So I don't know if any clarification could be added there as
So
well.
we could change the title. It would be, I mean, it's developing from step 1, like there's nothing yet. By the time you get to step 4, there is. So it's kind of a process throughout. The intention would be that we identify this need for the core guide. We then go through developing with the team. We release the resource for feedback. We make amendments to that resource, and then we release it permanently. Not saying, again, anybody at any time can give us feedback, but ultimately, the bulk of the feedback would come at one period of time.
You could also take that from the title.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Board Member Earl?
I'm sorry, but I am now even more confused, because you just said resource again, so I don't know whether at what point can an individual, and I'm talking about a board member, make a recommendation on a resource, however we're using that, in a core guide, however we're using that, to be used, at where would that
So
where
it's
would
going to
that
come in
fall?
that public feedback
So not
section.
until public feedback, can a board member ask staff to,
You wouldn't have
use?
seen it till we release it. That's why.
yeah, but that's, the question becomes, can I ask for something to be used?
Oh, you can ask anytime. This is not about
Okay.
asking for a resource.
So now
to
with
be
that in
added.
play, 11/15 of 2019, I asked for 4 resources to be vetted and used. That is why I'm asking. There's not been a lot of feedback. There's not been where's that resource at? And yet there's been other resources added to the core guides. So I'm not really understanding the process in engaging, perhaps, or maybe I've missed something. And that's the purpose of adding this, so that we can also engage in the process. And I feel like there is a responsibility we owe to those people that put us in office. I don't think it's just this one individual out there. That's not the case. We all engage. We all do what we can. So help me understand, so I'm,
Well, and first, I want to take
Okay.
into account, I apologize that you didn't receive a timely response. That's something we'll work on with staff. The intention would be anyone who wants to submit an option or an idea for us to include can be submitted. I think at that point, the core guides were completed. It was not in process. They were out. And so that might be part of the problem. If you know, for example, science is being created right now. If you have resources for science that you would like considered, now would be the time for that consideration to be most timely. But when we release those for the 30-day public feedback, that would be another opportunity to give additional suggestions for feedback in terms of adding resources or being concerned with a resource. Does that help clarify?
well, yes, and I have engaged with Jody at that. She's been very responsive.
Good.
So, and all board members received my request on 11/15, because I emailed it out to them and staff. So I would encourage you to vote for the amendment.
Okay, the amendment before us is to add the words "two board members" to step one. It would read, step one, request received from multiple districts or charters, two board members or staff identifies an area of need. All in favor of the amendment, please, discussion to that amendment? Yeah.
Just a question after all of that. So we are voting that two board members can say, we have a new set of standards, we need a core guide.
Yes.
But I think what you're asking is actually different. I think you're asking, I'd like to submit this resource to go through the vetting process. Like two different things.
Correct, so that this motion, as it's stated, would mean that two board members would be able to request that a core guide be developed. Is that correct?
That's what it is. Correct.
Okay. That a new core guide be developed, okay, that a new core guide be developed. Okay. Board Member Earl.
I'm sorry, this is so ambiguous, the whole dynamics of this. So I'm trying to not get a little emotional here, but because things keep changing, it is unclear, as to what we're even doing here. And I'm not trying to, staff I think have been good to work with, but there is like this ambiguous nature to this, and I can't figure out why it is or what's going on, because we should be able to request resources, and if that's not what this is, identified need, I'm not even really sure what that is right now. So my understanding is an identified need would be a request for a resource to be placed on there. Quality of resource, I don't know. So you're saying that it's actually requesting that a full core guide be developed?
Maybe it would be helpful for all of you, since you're on
Because-
our committee, to go through it, what the process is. Would that be of value?
I think that could be valuable.
Okay,
May
can I
I?
ask one question as you go through that whole
Yeah.
process? So maybe you can differentiate the difference between a new resource and an existing resource, and any processes that might be different in, excuse me, and when I say the word resource, I meant the
Core
core
guide.
guide. So a new request for a core guide and an existing core guide, what is the different process? And are both of those contained in this document, or is there another document that would reference an existing core guide reference? Okay.
So I'm going to start with a new core guide. So this is, the process in front of you is for a core guide development, something that's not been created, one that's not in place, okay? So, for example, science is not done, right? They're in process. So they receive from multiple districts. They're like, hey, we know we have new standards. It'd be really nice to have a core guide. It was a resounding please. So that was step one, is just somebody said, we would like this, but it's not just like one or two, it's many, because again, staff time they're pretty overwhelmed most of the time with the tasks. Step two would say, okay, we have this request, we're gonna meet this request and create the core guide. And then step three is we do initial review using the checklist. So the initial development team in step two is developing the resource without, they'll have seen the checklist, but it may not be as forefront of their mind as they're developing. So in step three, the resource is ready, we're thinking about releasing, we're gonna use the checklist now to review all of the resources within the core guides. The resources might be websites, a book, an article, things that might be referenced within the core guide. Then it goes through that review process, we go through the checklist, we get signatures saying, yes, I agree that it achieves this level of standard of expectation. And then we release it to the field for feedback. At that point, the field is anyone, so that would include board members, could then put in their feedback, and they could come before that. But in this case, the opportune time is step four, to say, I would like this resource considered, it didn't make it in there through the development team, please consider this resource. Or, I have questions or alarms about this particular resource, please take a look at it. And that would come from all public feedback. So LEAs, board members, parents, whoever might be reviewing the resource or the core guide. Then the development team would take the feedback, they would look at it, they would go through the resource with a more fine-tuned process and make any changes based on that feedback that they found through the process to finalize the document for release with those changes made. So that would be the process for a new one. So in consideration of this is just a call to create something. At step 4 is when you'd have the official call or request for resources or changes to the current draft of the document. So that is the process. Current guides, we only have math as the only current guide. Health is current. Health is going through this process right now to alleviate some concerns, to actually practice the process, to see if there's anything we would amend. I mean, this is new. We've never done it this way before. So we're using that process now, and it's working really well. Like I said, we've pulled some resources from the document, and Jody is using the ones that Board Member Earl suggested as part of that process too. We knew we were going to get to this point, but because we didn't have a process in place up until this point, we've been kind of in a holding pattern of how do we handle the feedback, given we didn't really have a process in place. So now that we have a process, it'll be pretty streamlined, at least not a hard and fast process. So hopefully that makes more sense. Not all of you have had my lovely presentation at committee. So just kind of giving you the 4 steps that it happens. There's definitely opportunities, and it doesn't take 2 board members at that point. It's anybody who wants to give us feedback can provide that feedback. So it doesn't take a broad representation. It just takes a single individual to say, consider this. And then the development team would do that consideration using the checklist as a connection, and to make sure it aligns. Part of the checklist is, does it align to the standard that is being presented? Because the core guides are just the standards and resources for each one.
And I wanted to add to that there are 7 criteria on the checklist. It is binary, yes, no. If at any point it meets the no, then the resource is taken off.
And I can do existing, but I'm almost wondering if we stick with like creating just for clarity.
However, I do think that understanding the difference, because I think that's part of the confusion right now, is people feel like, what is the process for a board member or a member of the public to say, I have a problem with an existing core guide, and if this isn't it, what is that step?
So within like an existing health, we're going through this process right now. So we'll do the checklist with the development team. We'll re-release it to the field and have that 30 days. So we're kind of, because we came midstream, health is taking this as part of their job right now. It wasn't done with health before. And then as science moves forward, science is already aware of the checklist and is starting to use that with their development team, so that during the process it's already being considered, and they'll follow this process, assuming it's approved here today.
Yeah, so and adding to that, if we go through, it wouldn't be the first 3 steps. It would actually land just on the steps of reviewing the checklist criteria, the 7 criteria for that resource that has been given. So it wouldn't go through the convening and all of those things. It would just go to the checklist for that resource to go through.
Board Member Bolter, just as a reminder, so that was kind of some information given to us in reference. The motion on the table is an amendment to add the word 2 board members to step 1. So this was an attempt to clarify the context of step 1. Board Member Bolter?
So perhaps maybe then the title of this needs to be fixed, because when I read USBE developed core guide resource review process, I'm reading it as we've got a developed core guide, and this is now the review process for reviewing the resources on those. So perhaps it should be developing core guide or something, because when we add that developed, then that's past tense to there's a resource on there that maybe there's a concern, or we have a resource that we would like looked at for an existing core guide. And I believe that was where my concern was, and I'm sitting here like, why can't I bring forward concerns? So, so maybe just changing that, and perhaps that could be an amendment, or does that need to be an amendment, or
We
is that
currently have an
just-
amendment.
I understand,
so-
I'm just saying for later on,
So
does that
let's-
need to be an amendment, or Is that just instruction?
I'm happy to do it. I don't know legally what you
I
need.
just don't know legally
If
what
it
we
adds
need.
clarification to the intent, you can change, the
Okay.
title is fine. So anyways, so we're back to our amendment, which is to request, to add 2 board members to step 1. So seeing no further discussion to that amendment, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, will the ayes please raise their hand? Most of the 2, okay, that amendment fails. Okay. Back to our original motion. Okay, so we have a motion on the table, so if you have any discussion to the motion, which is to approve the core resource review process. Board Member Davis.
Can we ask questions? Is that
Yes, you may
appropriate at
ask a
this point?
question.
So before my questions, I just want to say, I love the criteria. I love that you're going to create the format to be consistent across content areas. Because like right now in math, there's a list of resources, but in health, there's these embedded digital links, and who knows what science is going to do. So I think it just needs to be consistent across. Thank you for doing that. And I love that you mentioned keeping the scoring guides as documentation so anybody can access what those scores were on the different pieces of links or whatever. So I have a few questions. One is, for example, when people submit science textbooks, they get to do that annually, once a year. What is the timeline for submission for materials to be considered for this digital core guide? What, is it once a year? Is it twice a year? And then does the 30 days start from that date for the public to
Weigh in.
weigh in? That's I guess, and then I have, and how does the appeal process fit into that? And then I have one last question after that.
May I respond?
Yes.
So for the review process, it would just be during that 30 days. After the 30 days, we could collect responses, and when we have enough meat to go and do another revision, then we could take that into account. To continually add throughout would be cumbersome to the field to keep saying, oh, here's a new resource 2 weeks later. So that 30 days would be our kind of core. And then as we get a quantity of resources that would be timely to kind of update, because when you put a web link on, if any of you have tried to go a year later, those may be gone already. So us keeping them up to date and fresh, but they would need to go, if we did a revision, they would go back through this process. So the core guide, we identify a need. It's been a year or so. We want to review. We've had some feedback saying, I would like these vetting, these sources to be considered. We would collect that data over time, and then when it was time to kind of do a refresh, we could add those. But that 30 days would ultimately be
After the refresh.
the meat of
And
sending us feedback.
So are you saying you're not putting in links periodically throughout the year? You're doing a set of links,
And it's
letting public
maintaining.
for 30 days. It kind of keeps itself for a year. Then a year later, more people can say, hey, consider these. We
Yeah,
start the
we
process
get
again.
feedback all year, right? So after a month of it being released, maybe 2 months later, we get, hey, this great thing just
You
came
save
out.
it for the
Awesome,
next year.
we'll save it for the next iteration of the
Okay.
revision. But we can't keep updating it because people print these and start writing on them, and it could be an annual experience.
Right.
But it's definitely not something staff continually updates throughout the year. When it's done, they're happy to be walking away for a bit.
Okay, so, and then as part of that appeal process, just wondering if we've considered adding a, kind of like in UHSA, Utah High School Activities Association, how they have, like, they'll make a decision. If someone doesn't like it, they go back to the association. If they still don't like that decision, there's a 3-person outside kind of board. And then if they still hate that decision, it comes to us as a board and we vote. Have you considered anything like that as part of this appeal
Answer, like, what
process?
the current processes are that we thought were sufficient.
That's, but I still have the last question.
Go ahead.
Chair. So as we were looking over this, we were looking at the different processes at the end of who has which signature. So right now, we're talking about refreshing the document, and then if things are objectionable on it, is that what you're talking about to certain
To a public or
entities?
something, yeah.
to certain tenant entities. And that's where staff has been. And so even since the November first try at this is there's a difference between you as a board and different opinions. And we work for you. We are the staff of the board. And so in doing that, that's why this has been taken to an official vetting process in response to there's things that as a board, there's some disagreement on, and so to have that final vote of the board has been very helpful. So on this, that was actually talked about in committee as to whether or not we need to have another sort of a vetting of a vetter or some with that. And it did land in committee of having it here with the signatures. So once, if we talk about something new or something else that's been vetted or on here as pulled off, then are you saying, do you want it to be taken back through the criteria by a different committee, like a critical committee? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm saying if someone has a problem with it and you pull it off, it's over, right? But if it stays or someone wants something on that you choose not to put on and they want to appeal, is there another option?
So the way that we looked at it was the board already has processes and they would just follow that process. So contacting their board member and getting, I think it requires 2 board members to speak on the behalf or to bring it to committee. I don't understand all of that process as a public. I don't use that process, but I know you have one. And so that they would follow that way. I think the issue we've had in this case is it's a board member asking or a couple board members. And does that represent you as a body was a challenge for us as staff. How do we respond to the needs of 1 or 2 board members?
With differing
Given you have a
opinions.
body of 15 of you, would their needs also meet your needs? From a public standpoint, if the public comes and they come to the board, it eventually goes through all of you. And so maybe it's the same process for a board member to kind of go through that. That's, I think, where we probably need some direction, is if it's one of you coming, what's our response versus the public has a vehicle for getting their voice heard. It's board members, I think we had a difficulty, as board member Earl and Bolter experienced, figuring out how to respond and what that looks like, so.
Okay, so my last question is, can you give us kind of a hard and fast definition between resources, instructional materials, curriculum? Because I have heard from multiple people, and y'all can speak up if you want, and or I'll just speak for myself. But when we say these are just for resources for teacher knowledge, but they're not for instruction, student instruction or instructional materials, it's hard to wrap your head around that because you, as the analogy we discussed earlier this morning about math, you're saying, well, a math teacher might have knowledge for so much more beyond what the actual class content is. And then theoretically, if you have a student who's an advanced student and they, could need this much more, all the knowledge that the teacher gained in the resource now becomes instruction because it's being paraphrased or taught or used in the classroom. And so my question is trying to parcel that out into separate categories, convoluting the whole process. Have we considered just saying whatever resources come out under the USBE name we know may end up being paraphrased or used or whatever, however, in the classroom? Is there any, has that been discussed along the way?
May I respond?
Yeah. Let me
Oh,
take
you wanna
first
go
again. First, we can talk about the definitions, and second, there was a question. The question is a question for the board. So the definitions we can answer, but the second would be a question for the board and not for staff as to whether or not you guys would want to have that as the differentiation, because that's why these were created, is at the board request to do these things. So the first part of the question, then with the definitions, and go ahead.
Yeah, so I can define how instructional materials, also known as curriculum, is defined in code, because that's why we don't believe a core guide is an instructional material. Textbooks, workbooks, computer software, laser discs, yes, my friends, video discs, and communications media, which is basically tools that help to store data. And so those 5 things are how it's listed in code, and why a core guide is not or considered an instructional material is that they don't fit that definition. So we did have this conversation multiple times, trying to kind of work through what are these, do we need to define? Board member Hanson, Scott Hanson, asked a very similar question. We really had to work through it because the communications media at the end seemed very open and broad until we actually found the definition of what communications media stands for, and it's basically tools used to gather data, which is not something that we produce in a core guide. So we don't create a textbook, we don't create workbooks. If we do create a textbook, it goes through the Instructional Materials Commission, as well as the review process. But a core guide does not fall into this description of what an instructional material is. It is a resource in that way. We're considering basically anything that's not a instructional material would be considered a resource, is how I think we would define it at this point.
Can I follow up?
One follow-up.
I think we need to revisit that.
Okay, Board Member Scott Hansen.
Yeah, just following up on instructional materials, and we have spent a lot of time on this. I don't think there still is a meeting of the minds on this. I'm looking at the code 53E 4-401. As used in this part, instructional materials means textbooks or materials used as or in place of textbooks, and which may be used within the state curriculum framework for courses of study by students in public schools. Then it says to include, and it lists textbooks, and the last one is multiple forms of communications media. The place that maybe we differ is things that are used in place of textbooks and this communications media. I take that to be media that can be used to communicate a lesson or some information, not computers talking to one another, which is a very technical, the technical definition I don't think fits with this section of code when we're taking it in lieu of the language above, or in the context of the language above. When I look at the core guide, I see things like, I'm looking at the third grade core guide, and we have this document that says, Better Attitudes and Skills in Children, a collection of social emotional lesson plans and activities for K through 3. That to me looks like instruction material. I see another one that says a collection of videos and lesson plans that can be used in the classroom. That looks like instructional material to me.
So how does a lesson plan, okay, I've tried.
That's my point. We haven't agreed,
it's fine.
and we don't agree right now, but just,
When your teachers don't have the tools they need, they'll come to you. They can if they choose to, that's not our intention.
Right.
So it appears that there's a lot of conversation left on this topic. Is this something that would be appropriate to go back to committee as we talk about definitions of curriculum, instructional materials, et cetera? Chair,
We had
yes.
this, I'm just worried when it goes back to committee, because we have had this discussion so many times, and that's why we put at the top the code for instructional materials, because really, if you're in the classroom and you're a teacher, you know that anything that's not instructional material, like instructional materials are for student consumption. Anyway, I'm just worried if we send it back to committee, we're gonna go through the same circular reasoning and end up with the same thing, because for me, I feel like we have defined it. And I feel like we have professionals that know the difference, and we have professionals who know the standards. And so for me, I feel kind of frustrated because I don't know that we'll get anywhere in committee. We can try and we will do what you tell us to do, but is this the place to define everything and give like a little lesson on what are resources? You know what, I need some guidance in terms of being the chair of that committee for what you want.
Board Member Davis, do you have a, Board Member Davis, do you have a question?
Okay.
I guess my question is just, can teachers use any of this stuff in the classroom?
I will ask those guys, but
If that's a yes, then I don't think we need to have
if
this
it-
conversation. I
it's
totally
legal,
agree with you, but
if
it's been so
it
confusing.
meets the standards, I think Jody would be a good person. No, never mind, Jody's not a good person.
May I?
But Patty is a great person.
If they can use it, great.
So the intent is for teacher knowledge. The intent is not to have those used in the classroom. So when we're talking about the purpose of a core guide, the purpose of a core guide is for teacher knowledge. So if we talk about the intent and the purpose of each one, that goes within the definition. When we're talking about curriculum, we're talking about curriculum which is used for students and student consumption. So within training, and we're looking at core guides, within a training, it's good to do compare and contrast what is and what is not. So when teachers go through a training, they can see a lesson and say, this is what it may look like like. That does not mean that it's fair game for them to use that in their classroom, because we must remember that no matter what we put in our criteria or on this core guide, it is still up to each individual LEA to decide what it is they are using in the classroom for their students, for their teachers. So this is just a big bird's eye view, and these are on here for teachers in that training purpose to gather knowledge, the intent and purpose, and perhaps we need to say the intent and purpose at the top is for teacher training, which we kind of have up there, but then we have an intent and purpose for instruction and an intent and purpose for curriculum and an intent and purpose for standards as well.
Did that help, Cindy?
The other point would be, for content areas, yes, they could use it unless policy or code does not allow, which
That's
is,
what I was
in some content, you cannot use curriculum that's not approved by your local board to be used. So the vast majority, math lesson plans, yes. Health, in some cases, it depends on what the code is around, whether the curriculum needs to be locally approved or not. The resource we provide, the intention is to show a teacher what it could look like. If they choose to use it for curriculum, as long as it's not against the law, they certainly could. In some cases, it would be against, some cases when we, because it has to be approved through their local board for health education, so that's different. But the rest of them, yes, science, we could put anything on there and it would be fine. But for some content areas, just one. You'd have the code that would need to go through the local board.
Okay. Board Member Earl?
Thank
Speaking,
you.
are we back, we're back to our main motion, which is to approve this process. So remember, any definitions outside of this aren't necessarily germane to this motion. So if you want to speak to this process.
Can I
Yes,
speak
Board Member
before I have to be germane to the motion? Primarily because I've been on here just a little bit. We have actual curriculum listed on here, full curriculums, health relationships in 4th grade and 6th grade. We have full curriculums listed on here. And we have it, that's not the only one, the healthy relationships one. There's others. So once again, we're back to this ambiguity, or the fact that we put it under core guides somehow classifies it different is not an accurate statement. And I don't know why we're having this inconsistency, because you have a full curriculum, several full curriculums listed on here. And I've indicated those months ago when I went through these. Regardless, I have a motion, so. It's my motion number 2.
To amend, a motion to amend.
Motion to amend. I would like to add a step 5, which is an appeal process. And it's up there. It says, if a concern remains with a resource, an appeal process may be requested by another, I'm putting the same thing on there that we have for our other appeals processes. A state agency, 10 interested persons, or an interested association with a membership of not fewer than 10 individuals. The concern will be heard by a critical review committee for the purpose of reviewing the merits of the concern and evaluating vetting criteria. The critical review committee will make a recommendation to the board for final approval within 30 days of the written concern. A record of the critical review committee's recommendation will be submitted to, and I'm sorry, I did not spell this out clearly, so we can put deputy superintendent, or it could be Lorraine, whatever we need there, so that the issuer of the concern is aware of the action taken prior to the state school board's final vote. And then in parentheses, the critical review committee shall consist of 3 to 5 experts in the field of study relevant to the resource in question. This independent group may not be associated with the resource standards writing committee or resource vetting process. That's my motion.
Okay, the motion is to add a step 5 to the core guide resource review or development process. Is there any discussion to that motion?
I just have a
Board
question.
Member Gravitt?
Just for clarification, my understanding, this was already something we could do. So is it redundant? I just want to clarify.
Is step 5 redundant is the
Yeah.
question.
Is this something we can already do? Don't know who can answer that.
So there are steps board members can take to put it on the board agenda, which would basically put it in the public realm. Otherwise, they would just have to contact someone from staff and say, would you consider? This formalizes a process. Am I correct?
Yeah, it would formalize the process, and it just, to some level, how many people have to make the complaint before you start entertaining these? I worry about your burden and our burden of continuing to respond to these.
Other areas.
That's why I'm asking, don't we already have it in place? For rules, but.
Yeah, so the administrative rules process wouldn't apply.
Can I speak to the reason why? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the reason why. So you have individuals writing, well, a lot of the individuals, I think with the help, assisted with the standards writing. Then they wrote the actual core guides. And then they're gonna vet them. If they've already put the core guides on there, and they were part of the process of putting the core guides on there, and then they're asked to go through and vet them, I'm seeing you've got the same people doing, they wouldn't have put them on there in the first place unless they found that they wanted them on there for that standard. So you don't have a independent entity reviewing the vetting process. I think you can have the group do it the way it's set up here if you have some kind of appeals process, if there's a disagreement within the community or within organizations. So.
Okay, Chair Huntsman.
Thank you, Brittany. I'm going to say this again. I'm going to speak against it because I just don't see us getting into these operational issues. This is something that is a guide for teachers to choose. These are adults. Again, if they're reaching out and they need some help, they go to this place and they see what they see and they choose whether or not they want to use, not use, but learn from this and gain knowledge to be a better educator. The curriculum, again, and I don't know of a LEA out there that's not approving their curriculum, but this is not curriculum business. I also, as a board member, recognize the tremendous responsibility that we have on our superintendent, and I hold the superintendent accountable to everything that staff, you and your staff and the rest of the staff are doing. And if I have a problem or any board member has a problem, you can take it to the superintendent's attention and the superintendent will weigh it out or deal with it, whatever's happening in the staff. But I, as a board member, annually have a chance to review the performance of my superintendent and also keep that superintendent employed. And if I just see us getting down into the weeds of operations, we do not have enough time. It goes outside of who and what we're all about. I think as a board member, yes, we can listen to our constituents, parents, educators, and et cetera, but I have a vehicle to address if there's severe, or if there's concerns and stuff right now with the core guide process, and I don't want to create another one. We have enough to do. We have a hard enough time staying up with the things that we've already got on our plate. So I'm not saying that we're not being accountable, but we do have a person that's supposed to be accountable and is accountable that as a board member, I'm going to hold accountable. So I'm speaking against this proposed amendment.
Okay. Any further discussion to that amendment? Seeing none, the amendment before us is to add step 5 to the proposed process. As stated before you, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, will the ayes please raise their hands? Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Cindy Davis, Board Member Belknap, Board Member Scott Nielsen, Board Member Mike Haynes, is that right? Did I get Haynes? Board Member Michelle Bolter, Board Member Jenny Earl, and I'm a no. That passes. Okay, that motion passes.
Good fail.
That motion fails. I think there's. Is there any other motion?
Ties fail, right?
This- Board Member Davis,
Are you back to the original motion now?
Yes.
Are you ready for an amendment to the original motion?
so we're back to the original motion. Is there any further discussion to the original motion? Okay, so then that's part of discussion, so go ahead and make your motion. Board Member Davis?
I don't know what it's called. I move that we pass the core guide vetting process. It's called with
USB core guide
the
process.
USB-E core guide process with the addition of the words in the beginning, all of these materials may be used in the classroom upon approval of the LEA. Then, oh, can I speak to the motion?
Yes, you may. Oh, sorry, that motion, is there a second? Sorry. Okay, the amendment is to add the words at the top that any materials on the core guide can be used upon approval of an LEA. Is there any discussion to that amendment? Board Member Earl.
So after the last board meeting, after I listened to the standards and assessment, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go around to each of my districts, right? And I'm going to talk to their curriculum person because I want to know, you know, what's really what here? Or what's the usability of this? What's, going on? Well, first things, I think we're over baking it, number one. Can I use your phrase, Carol? Meaning, I really don't know that we need core guides, to be honest with you, because we list all those resources on the very next tab, except for a handful of them. And so we are going about doing an LEA's work in the first place. So I talked with my LEAs to see, is this what do you need? And it's interesting, the couple of comments that were said, especially in elementary school, is we have too much, you're sending too much to us, we can't stay on top of it, and we're gonna be lucky to even get help taught in the first place. We can put these little quotation mark, or these things on there that said, do not use the site, even though you're going to the site, do not use the site or reference it, which is not an accurate statement. When we send something out from USBA, whoever we are actually endorsing it. When it's on our site, we're saying, and it is our responsibility to make sure it is the most, not only up to date, but accurate and the best that it can be. And so this idea that that an LEA can approve it, well, it's our responsibility to have the best items out there. So yes, an LEA can approve it, and I've heard that said over and over again, but it just because we say it doesn't mean it is. So anyways, that's my comment. Whether we put this on or not, I don't know that it matters, so.
Board Member Gravitt?
I'm just surprised to hear that the core guides aren't useful, because as a teacher, and from what I've heard, they're very useful, and I didn't know if Terry Shoemaker would be willing to come and speak to that, if that's okay, Chair? If not, I
Yes,
understand that
yes.
too. That information is different than what I have heard.
Okay.
So,
A lot of it depends on, Terry Shoemaker with Utah School Board Association and the Utah School Superintendents Association. You're talking in huge generalities too, okay? So the experience of a teacher, how long they've been teaching matters. But as it relates to the materials specific to the core, any core guide matters. It matters a lot to them. And they'll tell you that. They're going to look at that as a reference as to what I should, not the standard will be there typically too, but they'll also see what materials are useful for them to be successful in teaching what is expected of them. So core guides have always been useful. In fact, years ago, when we started producing those kinds of things and having workshops around the standards, and whether it was for literacy programs and language arts and those kinds of things, we had huge numbers come to those courses. Not because they were required, because teachers wanted to be there. And I think that's true whether it's social studies, whether it's science, whether it's health, whether it's an elementary classroom too. So they're immensely useful, and labeling them appropriately is also helpful, but you need to understand that they're going to make decisions based on what they think is right. You would expect good teachers to do that. And we want to make sure that, I would encourage you to make sure that their decision-making doesn't get taken away in this process in any way.
Okay, Board Member Davis?
I just want to speak to the motion. I think that adding the language, these materials may be used in the classroom upon approval of the LEA, takes away that concern, or at least mitigates that concern that Board Member Earl expressed, that we are saying some of these will be okay to talk about in the classroom and some of these won't, and you figure out which one if you define the different things. I think this says we're putting our name on this. If you use this information in classes, you're going to use it if your LEA approves it, which we know is specific to health and not the other content areas. But I do think that language mitigates this concern that you have, that we are trying to say, this is just for us to talk about over here, and this is for us to maybe share in a classroom setting, and we're all going to figure out which is which. And just, if our name is on it, it could sometime come up for students, and we're okay with that because we've gone through this awesome vetting process that we've worked so hard to put together that covers the law, developmental appropriateness, things like that.
Are you done? You don't have a comment? Okay, the amendment before us is to add the words, "These materials may be used upon approval of the LEA."
I do it as the chair restates, and the chair restates. How the chair restates the motion.
Okay, so I'm going to restate the motion as, the amendment states that we would add, "These materials may be used in the classroom upon approval of the LEA." Board Member Bolter, is there a comment to this amendment?
So then it's instructional materials. Right, of course, it's in the set of what's identified by state law. So then in the core guides, basically we're putting links or ideas that can be used within the classroom should a teacher use it upon approval of the LEA. So then does the teacher need to go, I guess I'm trying to figure out how that's going to work. And in the code, 53G 10402, Prin 2, Prin F, it does state that the state school board shall recommend instructional material for use in the curricula required under subsection 2A after considering evaluations of instructional materials by the State Instructional Materials Commission. And so I guess I'm trying to understand, why would we put things on the core guide for teachers to learn from more, to learn more from, and then say, but by the way, that knowledge that you've just learned, do not teach it in the classroom. So if it is allowed to teach in the classroom, then it's instructional material. I guess we just need to say whether or not this is instructional materials or not.
Board Member Scott Hansen? Or Scott Nielsen?
Thank you.
I'm looking at you.
So the reason I'm supporting this, what Sydney said, is because if we are, well, I'm not speaking for the board, I'll speak for myself, but everybody's entitled to my opinion. If we are about local control, this is what that means. Maybe using the classroom upon the approval of the LEA. So those individuals, those teachers that are within those LEAs that have said, yes, this is okay, regardless if it's whatever material or instruction it is, can proceed with it. So that's what I'm trying to say is that if we're about local control, which I hope that at least I am, this would be something that I think that we should support.
I'm going to speak in regard to this motion. I'm speaking against it, not because I feel like we have this process over here and we're trying to fill in concerns with these odd patches that don't quite fit the process. I do have some concerns with how we are defining instructional materials and the differences in opinion on this, but I don't know that this process or this definition is how we get to the bottom of that concern. And so I'm going to vote no on this motion because I think there's another place and another time to solve the problem that keeps coming up as to how do we define an instructional material, what is that, what is our role of the State Board of Education of putting things on our website and saying that this is a material or a lesson plan, et cetera, for a school. And I don't think that this motion takes care of that, neither does this process. And so I think it's a separate conversation. So I'm going to vote no. So seeing no further discussion on this amendment, Chair Huntsman.
Sorry. And I'm back to the same thing as by this motion, right, by making this amendment in here, we're basically saying that we're going into the business of, the way that I see it, is curriculum. And I want to make every effort to stay away from going into that business. Because this just opens that, it's saying that we're going into it. But it does remind them that you still have to have approval. I don't think anything's going to be gained by that unless we have caution all over the whole process that says anything that you glean from any of the guide, if you're going to use it in a classroom, you've got to get approval from the LEA. That is not what that's saying. This is just opening the door that we're in a different business now. So I'm speaking against it again. I'm sorry to come on so late, Chair.
Okay, sorry. Is there any further discussion to this amendment? Superintendent.
I guess it's germane to the amendment, but overall, I've just been listening to this whole conversation, and the angst over what is an instructional material and a core guide, I don't know that we'll ever get really clean about that. So I would really, I will just take it on to get with staff and sit down and really go through our core guides and see, are we recommending a lot of materials in there? Because I will just refer to math, for example. The math core guides are used as a primary resource for understanding the standards. And when those were developed around the mathematics standards, they were new enough and comprehensive enough that teachers really need a deeper understanding. And so for one way that they're used, for example, is when they see an assessment item. And a teacher might say, well, that was not the intent of that standard. According to the core guide, that doesn't really meet that standard. So it's a way for teachers to actually vet materials. So that was really the intended purpose of core guides, was to really help teachers understand the standards. So I think we have an obligation as staff to really go back and look at the core guides and say, have we put things in there that due diligence in helping teachers understand the core guide, or the standards rather? That was the intention. If we have a lot of extraneous stuff that are good ideas, fun lesson plans, a lot of that may not be the right place to them. Because I just see you all really getting embroiled in this conversation about materials versus core guides for the purpose of vetting resources that are on there or not. And we're losing the purpose of the core guides, which was the intention, which were intended to help teachers understand the standards. Now, we've also had the conversation in the past about, well, standards should be written in a way that teachers just get it and understand them. But for some of these, they're pretty comprehensive. Health is outlined in code, and it's very specific. Math is complex, and it needs a lot of information. Maybe some of the other areas, the standards could be so clear that they don't need a core guide. But I just hate to see you spend a lot of your valuable time getting mired down in the materials. So let's, as staff, let's make sure that we go through the core guides and really take a look at, are there a lot of materials and resources on there that are not serving the purpose of helping teachers understand the standards?
Board Member Davis?
I withdraw my motion, and
Can't withdraw
I
the
can't
motion.
withdraw my motion.
You can, ask permission.
Can I substitute it?
You can ask permission from the body to remove the,
Do I have permission from the body to remove my motion?
without objection, then we can
Okay.
remove the motion. Is there any objection to that?
Can you
Okay,
make us an
the motion has
alternate?
been removed. Okay, okay, so now we're back to the main motion. Is there any further discussion to that motion? Board Member Davis?
Just in light of those comments, which I really appreciate, because I think that process will help figure out these lesson plans, our instructional materials, maybe they're going to be on a different list. This other stuff is for whatever. But my motion is that we approve the vetting process and send the definition that they're going to work on back to the committee so we get we come back with a clear definition of instructional materials
So is that a definition of a core guide
and core guide.
and instructional materials? Okay. So the addition, so the amendment is to add, so the, okay. Correct. So the question is, so the amendment is to add a request to go back and look at the definitions for instructional materials and core guide. Is that your motion? Is there a second?
I'm going to change it to resource.
Resource, okay. So
Just
the
come back with
amendment,
a definition of resource.
okay, so already we have the
resources.
motion on the table to approve the process.
This is a
So you're
resource review.
asking that the definitions of resource and core guide go to committee.
Yes.
Okay, is there a second to that motion? Okay, any discussion to that amendment, which would add? Yes. She took off instructional materials, so it's resource, so define the use of the term core guide and resource. Any discussion to that? Board Member Earl? So the motion is to add that in addition to approving the process, we would ask a committee to discuss the definitions or our use of definitions for the word resource and core guide.
So is this the final vote?
This, no, we are discussing the amendment, so the addition of that request. Any discussion to that request, that amendment? All in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay. Will the nays, so is there just one nay? Okay, one nay. Okay, so that passes. So now we're back to the main motion, which would be the committee the board, the motion before us is to approve the core resource review process as amended and send to committee a request to discuss the terms resource and core guide. Okay. Any discussion to that final motion? Board Member Earl.
Motion on review criteria number 4. I would like added, it says the material and its source contains content that is free from bias. And I think we need to be aware that, well, all right, that's my, and its source. It's down at the review criteria at the bottom. Number 4.
So the amendment is to add in review criteria number 4, the words
And its source.
and its source, on what line, please?
Well, it
Bullet
would
1,
need to
2,
go on each one of those. The material
Okay.
and its source contains, the material and its source contains, the material.
Okay.
So all 3 of those.
Okay, so is there a second to that amendment? Second. Okay, so the motion, or the amendment before us is to add the words "and its source" on each line, after the word "material" on each 3 of those criteria, check marks on criteria, review criteria number 4. Thank you. Yes, Betty Norman. Yep, okay.
I was just reminded that in speaking about going back to the source, it would then place an obligation on the board to state how far back you would go. You'd go back into the, how's it worded? AAG abuse, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
AAG Michelle Buse. I was just curious how far back you go. So does that mean you do a background check on the teacher that wrote this lesson plan? Or does that mean that you know, that's a very, very big obligation? You know, are you going to look at every shareholder in a company? What do you mean by look at its source? That's very broad and going to be interpreted very differently by each individual person. So I worry about that specific language, the way it's said. You may intend something specific that the language doesn't say.
So then help me. Someone, can I ask, is that all right, Chair? Help me, because many of these items come from, for example, it could be from Psychology Foundation, or it could be from Plant Love Grow, or it could be from Advocates for Youth. When we're actually citing the organization on the lesson plan, then I think we need to be able to say this organization, if we're sending them to a specific site, we need to be able to say that, you know, if they're going to weave through this, it's without bias, it's without that kind of a thing. I don't think you have to go digging deep. So what would you like the wording to be that would open that up?
I personally don't have a suggestion. It was just,
Okay.
that was a concern that I had with that language, to make sure that you understand the diversity of what pops into a committee member's mind when it says, I have to consider the background of it. So I don't have the answer to that. Maybe other board members could help with that.
So the amendment is to add "and its source" on these lines. Is there any additional comment to this amendment? Seeing none, all in favor of this amendment to add the word "and its source" after the word "materials" on review criteria number 4 on each of these check sentences. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, will the ayes please raise their hand? Okay, so there's 4. Belknap, okay. That motion fails. Okay. So we are back, Board Member Scott Hanson.
I think we're back to the
Yeah,
main
back to the
motion,
main
is that
motion,
right?
yep. The amended motion.
And I'm going to speak against the amended motion. As little as I want to do this, I think we should send this back to committee by voting no. And with the guidance that we received today, clean up both the process and the definitions. Once we have, this is very muddled as it stands now with regard to core guide, resource, those sort of things through this. And I think that with what we've heard today, we have maybe some traction to clean this up and come back with a cleaner version. So I'll speak against the the main motion with the intent that it be sent back to committee.
And I would just make the statement, whether it passes or it doesn't go back to committee, the first sentence might need a little bit of clarification on this as well. So the first sentence, yeah, so there's just a little bit of concern with that. So all in favor of, back to the main motion, we are going to, the motion before us is to approve the core resource review process as amended and request that committee discuss the terms core guide and resource as used in this context. Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Okay, will the ayes please raise their hand? Okay. Board Member Davis, Board Member Newell, Board Member Haynes, Board Member Lear, Board Member Gravitt, Board Member Board Member Huntsman. Sorry, that's fine. Board Member Cannon, are you a yay or a nay to pass this process? This is the amended motion, yes. Okay, so that's 6. Okay, so that motion fails. So, so then it could automatically go back to committee, or it would take a motion to go back to committee? Or, okay, leadership can assign this to committee to address the terms and the process. Okay, thank you. Chair Gravitt, that concludes your report. Thank you very much.